Some things refused to stay dead, not because death had failed, but because the thing that died had left something behind, something that the dying could not take with it, no matter how complete the dying was, a promise, made in the specific way that certain promises were made, not with words, not with the careful construction of language around something you wanted to be true, but with the body, with the specific physical commitment of someone who had already decided before the deciding was asked of them that they were going to be what they said they were going to be, regardless of everything the universe could produce to test the regardless. Asta had made that promise a long time ago in a world that had told him from the beginning that the promise was impossible, that the things he was promising were not available to something like him, something born without magic, in a world built entirely on the foundation of magic. The world had been wrong. He had proven it wrong with his hands, with his body, with the specific grinding, unglamorous, never finished work of someone who had decided that wrong was the only option. He had, when the world said impossible, and now he was back in a body that had not yet learned to walk, carrying everything he had earned in a life that had cost him everything earning required, and more. The crying woke the woman who had left him on the church steps. The first time he was not crying, babies cried. He was, for a moment, simply present in the specific disorienting way of someone who had been somewhere else and was now here again. He lay in the basket on the church steps in the specific cold of a Hage night and ran through everything he knew, which was considerably more than a newborn had any right to know: the Spade Kingdom, the Dark Triad, the Tree of Culifoth. Every devil he had faced, every fight he had survived on the specific combination of refusing to stop and the anti-magic that lived in the five-leaf clover grimoire that was even now present in the space between what he was and what the world expected him to be, waiting, as it had always waited, with the specific patience of something that did not need to hurry because it was not going anywhere, and neither was he. He also knew where Lieb was, could feel him the same way he had always felt him, since the contract, since the moment that two things that should not have been able to coexist had decided that the rules about what should were not rules either of them were interested in following. Lieb was present, quiet, in the way that Lieb was quiet when he was thinking, rather than reacting, which was a different kind of quiet than the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. Was the quiet of someone who had too much, and was deciding what order to say it in. So you're back, Lieb said, not in words, in the specific way that communication happened between things that shared the same space, at the level below words. Yeah, Asta said, back, a pause. You remember everything, everything, another pause, then something that in Lieb was the closest thing to laughter that Lieb produced when the situation was not funny, but was in the specific way that terrible things were sometimes funny when you had survived them completely and were now on the other side of them with the full understanding of everything they had contained. This is going to be very different, Lieb said. Yeah. Asta said, it is. Father Orsi found him in the morning, as he always found him in the morning, because the morning was when Asta arrived in both versions of the story, and Father Orsi was always the ones who opened the door and found whatever the door had been left for him to find. He picked up the basket and looked at the child, and the child looked back with eyes that were not a newborn's eyes in any of the ways that mattered. Father Orsi, who was a man of faith and therefore had a specific relationship with things that defied the ordinary explanation, said a prayer and brought the child inside and decided that whatever was looking at him from this child's face was something he was going to trust to reveal itself in its own time, which was, as it turned out, the correct decision. Arrived shortly after, as he had always arrived, shortly after. Because some things were not changed by the restarting, were simply the shape of how certain stories began, regardless of which version was being told. Asta looked at him from the crib they shared and felt something that did not have a clean name in any language, something that was not quite grief, not quite relief, not quite the specific complicated quality of someone encountering something they had missed more than they had allowed themselves to know they had missed, until the missing was no longer the thing. And the thing itself was back. Hey, he said in his head, because his mouth was not yet capable of the things his head was. Hey, Yuno looked at him with the expression he would always look at him with, in some form, for the rest of both their lives, the expression of someone who had encountered something that did not fit any of the categories they had built to organize the world, and who was, in that specific moment, deciding whether to build a new category or simply accept that some things did not need categories. To be real, the years moved in the specific way. That years moved when the person living them was not discovering what they contained but navigating what they already knew. Was in them with the specific patience and the specific impatience of someone who knew exactly where they were going and could not get there any faster than the body they were in. Would allow he trained, not the way the first timeline had trained him, not the reactive desperate training of someone discovering in real time what they needed to be capable of. As the situations arrived, that demanded capability, he trained with the full knowledge of everything the previous life had built, rebuilding it in a body that was younger, fresher, and had the specific advantage of being given something to rebuild toward rather than simply build without knowing what building looked like when it was finished. The physical conditioning started before he could walk in the specific ways. That conditioning started before walking, which was in every way available to something that could not yet stand. He worked the muscles. He could work, he built the foundations. That foundations were built from he was, by the time he could walk, already ahead of where the first timeline had put him, at the same stage, and by the time he was 5, he was somewhere that the first timeline had taken years of the specific brutal, necessary education of real fights with real consequences to reach. The other children at the church noticed, not in the ways that would have been noticed by anyone paying attention from the outside, but in the ways that children noticed things about each other that adults often missed. Asta was different, had always been different in the first timeline. But the difference in this timeline had a different quality, was not the difference of someone who had not yet found their place in the world, was the difference of someone who had already found it and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to where they already were. Yuno trained with him as he had trained with him the first time. Because Yuno was Yuno, and Yuno's relationship with competition was not something that a different version of events was going to fundamentally alter. He pushed, and Asta pushed back. And the pushing was different from the first time because the first time, Asta had been pushing against the specific weight of someone who had something that he did not, and was trying to close a gap that everything around him insisted was not closable. This time, he was not pushing against a gap, he was pushing beside someone who happened to also be pushing toward the same thing from a different angle. The difference was everything. Lieb was different too, not in what he was, but in the relationship between what he was and what Asta was. The first time, the union had been built through the specific process of two things learning what the other was. While the situations that demanded that learning were already underway, this time, the learning had already happened, was complete, was the foundation, rather than the ongoing project. They were not two things. Learning to coexist were two things that already knew exactly what the coexisting required and were building from that knowledge, rather than toward it. The grimoire ceremony arrived as it always arrived, in the specific way of events that were in some fundamental sense fixed, not because they could not be changed, but because the shape of them was determined by something deeper than individual choice, by the specific logic of what the world was and what it produced. When the conditions were what they were, Yuno received the 4-leaf clover, as he always received it, because Yuno was always going to receive it. That was simply what Yuno was. The crowd murmured. The crowd always murmured at Yuno in the specific way that crowds murmured at things that confirmed what they had already suspected was exceptional. Asta stood at the front of the line for his turn with the specific quality of someone who was not hoping for a particular outcome, because hoping required uncertainty about whether the outcome was coming, and Asta already knew what was coming. The ceremony produced nothing, as it had always produced nothing for him, because the 5-leaf clover did not come from ceremonies, did not come from the structures that the world had built to distribute what the world considered valuable. It came from somewhere else, from the specific place that things came from. When the ordinary places had decided they had nothing for you, the crowd did not murmur at Asta. The crowd did what crowds did when the thing in front of them was the absence of something they had expected to see. It produced the specific sound of collective certainty about something they had always believed being confirmed by the universe itself. Asta let them. He stood in the silence, that the absence of the grimoire had produced, and felt nothing that the crowd expected him to feel because he already knew what was in the air. Between him and the things that was coming, the five-leaf clover grimoire did not arrive during the ceremony, it arrived later in the specific moment when it had always arrived. When the need for it was real and immediate, and the ordinary options had run out when the world had produced a situation that required something outside the categories of what the world had decided to make available. Asta reached for it, not with the desperate, drowning grab of someone who needed a lifeline, but with the steady, certain reach of someone who knew exactly what they were reaching for and where it was and what it felt like. When their hand closed around it, the grimoire opened and the demon's sword was there. As it had always been, waiting in the specific patient way of something that knew its moment was coming and had no reason to hurry or worry about whether the moment would arrive. Because it always arrived, for the things that were meant for each other in the end, what followed was different from the first time, not in the shape of the events, the same threats, the same enemies, the same fundamental architecture of a world that had specific problems built into its structure that required addressing before the structure collapsed under the weight of what they were producing, but in the quality of how Asta moved through the events that shape produced. He did not discover, he recognized, he did not learn. He remembered, and the remembering changed everything about how he moved, not because he avoided the things that had hurt him the first time. Some of them could not be avoided, were the necessary cost of the things they produced, but because he moved through them with the specific quality of someone who understood what they were and what they were for, and what they would eventually produce if he held the way he had learned to hold the first time, through the specific grinding education of holding when everything around you was designed to make holding feel like the wrong choice. He arrived at the Magic Knight selection exam with the full memory of what the selection exam had been the first time, which meant he arrived with something that the first timelines Asta had not had at this specific moment: composure, not the absence of the energy, not the absence of the volume. Because Asta was Asta, and Asta was not someone who became someone else, regardless of how many lives he had lived, but the composure of someone who understood what the exam was, and what it was for, and what the people administering it were actually looking for beneath the specific theater of assessment that exams were built around. He made it into the Black Bulls, as he had always made it into the Black Bulls, because the Black Bulls were, in some fundamental sense, his, in the way that certain things were certain people's. Not through ownership, through the specific fit between what a thing was and what a person was that made the two more complete together than either was separately. He walked through the door of the Black Bull's base for the second time in two versions of the same life, and felt what he had felt the first time, but understood this time what the feeling was: home, not the home of a place that had always been his, but the home of a place that he had earned, the specific kind that meant more because of what the earning had cost. Yami was there, looking at him with the specific expression that Yami had for things he had not yet decided what to make of, which was, in the early stages of most things, his default expression. The sword came out as it always came out, as it would always come out for Yami, because Yami's relationship with the people around him was expressed through the specific language of violence, not because he was cruel, but because violence, in Yami's understanding, was the most honest form of communication available between people who were capable of it, because violence could not lie about what you were the way words could. Asta caught the killing intent before it landed, not with anti-magic, not with the grimoire, with the specific calm of someone who had been here before, who knew exactly what this was and what the correct response to it was. He met Yami's eyes without flinching, without the desperate scrambling of someone encountering something larger than themselves. For the first time, with the specific steady quality of someone who had encountered this specific thing before and had come out the other side, understanding it better than the thing perhaps understood itself. Yami looked at him for a long moment. The sword went away, not because Asta had passed a test, but because Yami had seen something in the eyes of this small, loud, no-magic boy that he had not seen in most of the people he had met in a life that had met a great many people. He had seen someone who was not performing. Not for him, not for the situation, not for the specific theater of proving yourself that new recruits performed almost universally, simply present in the specific complete way of someone who had nothing to prove, and knew it, and was not, despite knowing it, going to stop trying. Interesting, Yami said as if the word was a complete sentence, which, for Yami, it was. The Black Bulls were the same, as they had always been, chaotic, loud, the specific beautiful disaster of a group of people who did not fit any of the categories that the world had built for people to fit into, and who had found in not fitting the specific thing that fitting could never have given them each other. Asta moved through them with the full knowledge of what each of them was, not as an advantage, not as a strategic resource, as the specific, complicated, irreplaceable thing that knowing someone, truly knowing them, allowed the relationship between what they presented and what they were underneath. He was kinder than the first timeline had allowed him to be at this stage. Not because he was softer, but because kindness required knowledge of what the person in front of you actually needed, and he had that knowledge already in ways that the first timeline had taken years of being beside people to build. He had it now from the beginning and used it in the specific, quiet ways that kindness was used when it was real. Rather than performed, the enemies arrived, as they always arrived, in their specific order with their specific powers and their specific reasons for being what they were. And doing what they did, the Eye of the Midnight Sun, the Diamond Kingdom, the Spade Kingdom, the Dark Triad, the Tree of Culifoth, all of it coming in the specific order that the first timeline had assembled it, and Asta, who knew the order, did not try to prevent everything that the order contained, because preventing everything was not what the knowledge was for. Some things needed to happen to produce what they produced. The Diamond Kingdom had to become what it became for the people inside it to find what they found in the becoming, and Asta understood this in the specific way of someone who had watched the first time what happened when things were allowed to develop at the pace they needed to develop, and had learned the difference between the things that needed that pace and the things that needed interruption. He interrupted the things that needed interrupting with the specific efficiency of someone who already knew where the interruption was most needed and what form the interruption should take. Rads he found before the attack, not to prevent the attack but to have a conversation, that the attack in the first timeline had made impossible by arriving before the conversation could. He sat across from a man who had every reason to refuse the sitting and said, "I know what they did to you." Rads looked at him with the expression of someone who had been prepared for many things from this encounter, and had not been prepared for that. "I know what they took," Asta said, "and I'm not here to tell you that what they did was acceptable, or that what you became because of it was wrong. I'm here because you deserved better than what you got, and what you get from here is going to be determined by this conversation." Rads looked at him for a long time with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for a very long time for someone to say the thing that needed to be said, rather than the things that were easier to say. Then he said, "Who are you?" Asta told him exactly who he was, the Magic Knight without magic who was going to be the Wizard King. Not because the world said so, not because any structure or institution or system of assessment had decided that he was fit for it, because he had decided he was going to be. And had not in any version of any life stopped deciding, no matter what the world produced, to test the decision. Rads looked at him for a very long moment, then something that might have been a different version of the smile he had given the first timeline at the very end of a much longer, much more costly journey to this specific moment appeared on his face earlier, this time at much less cost to both of them. The fight with the Eye of Midnight Sun changed because Asta changed it, not dramatically, not in the ways that announced themselves, but in the specific ways that mattered. He knew where Licht was when Licht did not know he was being found. He knew what Licht was carrying before Licht had decided whether to show it, and he approached it with the specific, direct, completely unembarrassed honesty that was in every version of this story. Asta's specific gift, that had nothing to do with anti-magic or the grimoire or anything the world would recognize as power, but that was in every fight that mattered, the thing that changed what the fight was. He told Licht what he knew about what had been done to his people, what he knew about Tesha, about the child, about the specific weight of a grief that had been turned into a weapon by someone who understood that the most powerful thing in the world was not magic, was the specific pain of someone who had loved something and lost it and had nowhere to put the losing except back into the world that had produced it. Licht listened in the specific way of someone encountering for the first time. The version of their own story, told by someone who was not inside it and therefore could see things that the inside made invisible. What followed was not the fight that the first timeline had required, was something that produced the same outcome through a completely different path. The Spade Kingdom was the thing that could not be changed by conversation alone, was the thing that required what anti-magic and Liebe and the full expression of everything Asta was could bring to the specific problems that the Spade Kingdom and the Dark Triad represented. He went into it with more than the first timeline had allowed him to bring. Not just the power had developed further in the years that the earlier training had produced, but the specific knowledge of what the fights inside the Spade Kingdom required and where the requirements were most critical. He went to Zenon with the full memory of what Zenon was and what had made him what he was, and what, in the first timeline, had been left too late to address. He went to Zenon, and he did not immediately fight. He asked the question that the first timeline had never had the space to ask, because the space was always already occupied by the fighting. By the time anyone arrived at where the asking could have happened, he asked, "Do you actually believe in what you're doing, or have you been doing it for so long that belief and doing have become the same thing to you without you noticing when they stopped being the same thing?" Zenon looked at him with the eyes of someone who had been asked something they had not expected to be asked in this or any other situation, and who was in the asking encountering something they had been successfully not encountering for a very long time. The fight happened because the fight was always going to happen between Zenon and anyone who stood where Asta was standing in this or any other timeline, but it happened differently because the question had been asked, and even questions that did not receive answers left something in the person they were asked of. A small fracture in the certainty that had been holding everything together, and fractures in the right place changed what structures could hold. Lucifero was the thing that could not be questioned into a different shape, was simply what it was in the complete, uncomplicated way of something that did not have the specific vulnerability of beings who had chosen to become what they were and therefore could be reached through the choosing. Lucifero was simply what it was and required simply to be stopped with everything available. Asta stopped it with Liebe in the complete, united way that the first timeline had built toward over the full course of everything it had taken to produce the specific relationship between these two things that made the stopping possible. Except this time the building had already happened, was already complete, was the foundation rather than the destination, and what was built on a completed foundation was different from what was built on a foundation still being assembled while the building was already underway. Was simply more. Lucifero fell. The tree of Culifoth did not open. The world did not end. And in the quiet that followed, the specific quiet of a world that had come very close to something and had not, because the person standing between it and that something had refused, as he always refused, to stop being what he had decided he was going to be. Asta sat in the wreckage of what the Spade Kingdom had been and looked at his hands, small hands by any standard that the world used to measure the hands of people who were supposed to be what he was. He looked at them and felt Liebe beside him in the specific way that Liebe was beside him, which was completely and without the distance that the first timeline had required so much work to close. "Hey," Asta said. "Yeah." Liebe said. "We did it." "Yeah." Liebe said again. A pause. "Same thing you said last time." "Yeah." Asta said. "Some things don't change even when everything else does." Liebe was quiet for a moment. That was longer than the exchange had indicated it would be. "You changed." He said. "I know." Asta said. "Is that okay?" Liebe said. Another pause. "A different kind." "Yeah." Asta said. "I think it is. I think changing while staying who you are is the whole thing, not just the fighting, not just the winning. That's the whole thing." The world continued, as worlds continued, after the things that had been threatening to end them were ended, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific complicated work of rebuilding something that had been broken in ways that required more than simply replacing what had been removed, required building something new in the space where the broken thing had been something that accounted for the breaking in the specific way that things built after breaking were stronger at the broken places than things built before with no knowledge of what breaking required of the things that survived it. Asta was the Wizard King eventually, as he had always been going to be because that was simply what Asta was going toward in every version of the story. Regardless of what the story put in the way of the going, he stood in the ceremony that made it official with the specific quality of someone who had arrived at the place. They had been going for as long as they could remember and found that arriving was not the things the going had been about, the going had been the thing itself. He looked at the people who were there, the Black Bulls, Yami, everyone who had been in every version of every fight that had led to this specific room, this specific moment, this specific ceremony, and felt what he had felt every time he had felt anything that was worth feeling in either version of the only life he had ever known how to live: gratitude. Simple, unqualified, for the specific gift of the people who had been beside him, not because they had to be, but because they had chosen again and again in every version of the choosing to be, and because that choosing was in every version of every story that had ever mattered. The whole thing, simply the whole thing.